Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that has been away so long. I'm surprised there isn't another Prime Minister yet. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Oh yeah, not bad. Probably better than our previous Prime Minister's feeling, I guess, after I think we touched on in our Patreon bonus beforehand that when we last spoke, we had a different Prime Minister. I'm sure we'll get to that quite quickly as we go through like a recap here of the news. But yeah, I think we said Truss was not long for a prime ministership, and was not particularly surprised. Did we? I can't remember actually if we managed to predict that because we recorded long enough in advance. I feel like our podcast. It was one of those times where our podcast was almost pipped to the post by the actual news, but then actually it was still kind of relevant because there was a bit of news going on around all of that. So I think we got away with it.
I was having a look at the notes last time. It was sort of like Liz Truss had said she'd resigned, but we had yet to know who would win the ensuing leadership race. So
right, yes.
So that's where we're going to pick it up today.
So I think it's fair to say we're not going to bother with the headlines. We're going to just rush into, these are essentially the headlines, but not specific headlines like we normally do. It's just kind of the continuing story of the Tory party kind of falling apart a bit. You set the scene. Liz Truss had agreed to resign and needed to be replaced. And I don't think the country really wanted to spend 2 months selecting another leader again when we'd only just had a leadership election, even though the Conservatives can choose how they run these things. So they could have said we're going to do it for 2 months, but probably wouldn't have been best for their image. So what happened with the leadership contest, the second leadership contest this year?
Yeah, so the Conservatives were left at a bit of a quandary what to do. Essentially, there were lots of people saying you should have it as a coronation, so we should only let the MPs talk about it rather than let members decide. Where there were others, such as I think one particularly strong voice was Nadine Dorries, basically saying that no, you've got to have members involved, we've got to have some of it, because otherwise, or she was even calling for a general election at points, because she said any leader who would be elected wouldn't really have a proper mandate to govern. So there was a bit of hand-wringing within the Conservative Party, and they came up on a compromise, which was that the contest was going to happen over a week. You had to get over 100 nominees from your MPs within your party to stand. That is designed to make sure you could only really have 3 max, although if they did, that would suggest that your party is split 3 ways, which would have been very tricky for anybody trying to take control of the party. The whole aim of this thing was trying to make it quick and fast and make sure that you get a leader done, because as you mentioned in the preamble there, that they'd had a leadership contest that had gone on for 2 months, pretty much between final 2 candidates, between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. And the 2 months of campaigning, I think it's fair to say, didn't leave us with the best leader for the job, at least in the eyes of the country, maybe not in the eyes of the Conservative membership. So, and
I'd also add at that point, as I think we touched on in our first episode back, there was a lot of ammunition generated for Labour in the kind of the slinging match between the various sides, and especially between Sunak and Truss, as it got into the final bit where, they had to make this is a weird bit where they need to look better than the other person, so they need to make them look bad, but also they don't want the Conservative Party to look bad overall because they're going to have to lead. But I'm not sure they necessarily achieved that final part there.
Yeah. So yeah, you're left with that situation where you don't want to have that big slagging match. You want to get it done quickly. We'd said before as well over that 2 months that maybe the country was kind of sleepwalking into crisis. Like we needed action on gas prices going up, for example, but we didn't have a leader in charge. Boris Johnson couldn't make that decision because he was a lame duck prime minister, and we had 2 people waiting in the wings who might have had a very different policy to that. So the government did nothing. You couldn't afford to sit on your hands again for another 2 months. The Conservative Party have to nominate their leaders. There were 3 potential frontrunners or realistic choices that could go ahead. Rishi Sunak, because he was the loser in the last election. Penny Mordaunt, she'd failed to make it to the final 2, but was in the final 3. And, oh my goodness, he's cashed in his money in the bank. He's back again. Boris Johnson,
It's Boris Johnson with the steel chair.
Exactly, yeah. He flew in all the way from Antigua because he'd been on holiday while all this had happened, to say, yes, I might give being Prime Minister another go, which so I've a sidebar here. I've left Twitter now, which has made me far happier, and it consumes less of my life. But when that Boris Johnson thing was going on, Twitter was a bit of a mad place, and there seemed to be this weird, as there always is around Boris Johnson, this circus of speculation and you don't know what's real and what's bluster and what's false. Essentially, he said that the nominations, they have to get 100 MPs to back them. And Rishi Sunaks were coming out on Twitter or wherever they can, quite publicly backing Rishi Sunak. Boris Johnson was saying, I'm talking in the background, I've definitely got the numbers, yeah, I've got 100. But the people who had publicly backed him was only around 40 to 60. Now, it must be stated that the Conservative leadership rules say that you didn't have to make your nominations public, right? So it is very possible that Boris Johnson had the 103 signatures that he needed to stand in that contest. However, there is a little bit of a worry there that if your 103 members, if 40 of them aren't even willing to make their nominations public, what does that say for your candidacy? Because you have to remember that, I think we mentioned it last time, or hey, we spent most of this podcast mentioning about why Boris Johnson is problematic in cases, but to reinstate a leader who left because he was embroiled in a scandal that is still not over. It's still being investigated by House of Commons committee, namely some of the COVID stuff, whether he lied to Parliament about whether he knew there were parties in Downing Street. One reason his party was so keen to get rid of him was that, they didn't see him as conservative enough. They thought that he was sort of ideologically baseless, and they felt that they were drifting and without direction, so he didn't have the support of the backbenchers. So if he can barely scrape 100 MPs together to support him, whereas Rishi Sunak might have closer to 200 by the end of it, you end up you risk splitting your party, so he's risky there. And yeah, finally you've got essentially like the court of public opinion in the fact that Boris Johnson was not a very popular prime minister when he was removed by when he was last prime minister. The polling was awful for him. He seemed to be losing by-elections and losing cabinet ministers. If you think how many people had to resign to get Boris Johnson out, some of those people who had resigned, Nadeem Zahawi, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, posted an article saying that he was backing Boris Johnson again. And these, what has changed within the last 2 months that your opinion has taken a full 180. The funniest thing about Zahawi was that he published that article in the Telegraph saying, I'm making my support public. This is why I'm backing Boris. He is Boris 2.0. 2 minutes later, after that article is published, Boris Johnson says, I've got the numbers, but I'm not going to put myself forward as a candidate. Essentially, for the reasons we've underlined, really, just there, but he felt that it wasn't the right time. It was too soon, he said, to make a comeback, which I think was the right decision on his part. He may have won if it had gone to the members, but I don't think the country would have thanked him for the ensuing chaos. It almost certainly, for me, would have been anyway almost a constitutional crisis of what do you do with a prime minister that, exhausted every means to remove him and then feels that he can waltz back into office because 17,000 Conservative members still think he's okay for the job. Yeah, it seems a bit. So that was Boris in and out like it didn't happen. And once Boris was out, the contest sort of calmed down. Rishi Sunak always had the numbers amongst MPs. He got his fairly early. The big question was it going to the members? Was Penny Mordaunt able to get the 100 signatures that she needed? In the end, when the deadline came at about 12 o'clock on Monday, she was around 20 short. So that left one man, Rishi Sunak, being able to be coronated as the leader of the Conservative Party and therefore as our new Prime Minister with only MPs voting on it. Not the first time that's happened. That happened with Gordon Brown when he took over from Tony Blair. There was essentially nobody to stand against Gordon Brown in that leadership election. But yeah, it does feels odd that you're sort of reducing democracy down to just the MPs to get somebody in. I think that's reflective of how desperate the Conservative Party were just to get anybody in quickly and be stable. And we'll discuss what Rishi Sunak's done in a couple of months, but I do think that's kind of the vibe that he is going for.
Yeah, I think we discussed a bit that he seemed like the more stable choice, and I mean that in like for the country. He had a track record, regardless of things like his non-dom status and stuff we've touched on before. Stuff about his wife that's been mentioned as well. But we were like, out of the options of him and Liz Truss was the chaos candidate. And then she came in and she was the chaos candidate. So if you had to pick from those two again, I think we'd probably go for the person who had been Chancellor of the Exchequer and knew a bit more about how to run a country, one would assume. Like, maybe he's done something secretly awful that we don't know about. But on the basis of those two candidates, I think most people I spoke to were like, well, I mean, if I had to pick, Sunak. So it's not surprising at all that he kind of came in there. I did think there was a chance that maybe, I don't know if Boris is kind of messing around as the reason Mordaunt didn't manage to make it. There was a bit where apparently he had a chat with her, where he was like, look, I've got this support, so you shouldn't run and you should back me. But again, that's all hearsay, like all stuff that happened behind closed doors and people have said maybe happened. And yeah, I think it was kind of inevitable from the field we had that we would get Sunak. Not particularly surprising that we got him. But I guess the question is, has he lived up to that kind of, steady man at the rudder kind of idea that he'd set up for himself? Did he steady the ship, I think, is question one. I guess the Bank of England did stop having to suddenly bail out the country, which I guess is a good thing. So in a very short term point of view, he did immediately fix some things just by coming in, like you saw the pound bounce and things like that. But where's it gone since then?
Yeah, so I think you're right that he is. For me, he's made politics boring again, which is probably the least successful, like, make America great again type slogan that you can have. Nobody's going to be printing that on baseball caps. But it does, doesn't it? After I feel that in all the time we've been doing this podcast, we've had, ups and downs and lulls and Brexit and things happening. But particularly when you had, if you think of the chaos of Theresa May and her going and then Boris, and then there was never sort of a dull moment with Boris, even through COVID, even though it calmed, even though maybe some of the scandals calmed down at the start of COVID as the nation had to sort of come together, he soon found his way to find trouble. Under Rishi, there seems to have been little of those big scandals that have happened, although they have been rumbling on in the background. You've got very early in his premiership, you had the Gavin Williamson stuff come up, allegations of bullying. He was appointed to the cabinet as sort of a minister without portfolio, and because of those allegations, he had to leave. There's also been a lot of pressure on Sunak over Suella Braverman, who, of course, was... she's foreign secretary or home secretary? She's home secretary, isn't she? She's home secretary, and she was under Liz Truss until her resignation or sacking, depending on who you believe. Essentially, was one of the big was one of the forebears of Liz Truss's downfall and what forced her to resign as prime minister. She was appointed right back into the cabinet, even though Liz Truss had said that she'd broken the ministerial code, which made a lot of people raise their eyebrows and say, hey, hold on a minute, have you got the right judgment to be Prime Minister? This is the sort of thing that we would have dragged Boris Johnson over the coals for. So, yeah, he's got sort of problems in his own party there. He's also got the big thing that we talked about under Liz Truss was the economy. And one of the reasons that she failed was that her bold economic plan to get growth going was essentially rejected by the markets. And that caused huge problems for government borrowing. Fluctuation in the markets put pressure on British pensions and if we were going to be able to pay our loans back. And that's why people started to freak out. That's why the Conservatives said, oh my goodness, we've got to get rid of her, because if we don't, the entire economy could crash on our watch. I think it's fair to say that we are not in those panic stations anymore, but that has come at the price of a great sort of tightening of the belts. Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor delivering a very gloomy autumn statement, which essentially suggested that there would be tax rises and cuts in public spending as well. All of that means that, if he is overseeing quite a weak economy there, Rishi Sunak, or one that isn't flourishing, that's a very hard sell to the voters the next time round in 2 years. So he has steadied the ship in that sense on economic grounds, but he's got very few levers he can pull now to suddenly make the economy burst back into life, which is the real one of the big underlying problems for the Conservatives at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, like, to touch on the kind of real effects this has, we mentioned in our pre-show thing, available for Patreons, belts are tight. I mean, Again, as I think we normally say whenever there's something bad going on, if you can give money to someone more in need than us, please do. But if you want to give some money to your podcast, become a patron, get some bonus recordings of Rob and I chatting about things like the fact that I couldn't buy a house due to all of this. But yeah, I mean, that's the kind of real effect it has. The housing market being affected, loads of people who are trying to buy houses not being able to. I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories from other people where they've been trying to buy a house and then so either people who failed to buy a house because of the kind of things happening, or they were able to buy a house because someone else's mortgage fell through because of the kind of knock-on effects of all of this. And it's looking like the housing market's going to drop next year as well, which if, the general idea is you buy property, it goes up in value, so it's a good investment. If you just bought something at kind of the top of the market and then next year it drops 10%, that means you're kind of stuck there in negative equity for a while before you can eventually sell your house, which on a grand scale is considered not good for the economy, although we probably should make more houses available, which would inherently make all housing cheaper, which, yeah, there's a whole load of economic stuff we're not going to go into there with regards to houses. But yeah, I mean, that's the kind of real effects it's having on people. And that's before we get on to other things we're going to be talking about this episode. So yeah, I guess weak economy, things are not great. No one ever everyone blames a weak economy on the current government. We know this to be true, regardless of how likely it is. In this case, I think there definitely are some things that have happened. But yeah, there's a thing in the US where people always blame the president for bad economy, and it's normally not the president's fault. It's just he happens to be the person there, so they go, oh, it's this guy's fault. It's not strictly true. I think here we have some specific things we can probably point to, and I guess we should now move on to the kind of more general thing, the winter of our discontent. So what's going on? I mean, we've touched on Ukraine before, we've touched on other things, but things are getting worse for the average person is the take home, but I think maybe you want to dive into the detail a bit more.
I mean, just you've covered that in very broad strokes. You're right, and so the continued war in Ukraine is having effect particularly on gas prices and heating and how we manage our own energy supply. There have been rumblings that there would be some government advice out about how to limit the energy that you use over the winter, with the worry that there might have to be rationing. That hasn't happened yet, but clearly people have it fresh in their minds that they don't want to turn the heating on as much. The weather this week seems to have suddenly turned to a cold snap, which is certainly the first week where I feel I'm turning the heating on a lot in our house at the moment, or at least a lot more. And the fact that like BBC News have to run articles and the government have to run reports saying, remember to turn your heating on when it is this cold. Don't be so worried that you can't turn your heating on at all. But of course, that's a very real problem for some people who will, we've talked about people having to choose between heating and eating. That was when the weather wasn't this bad. So we might see the effects of that come through. That is coupled with rising inflation, which is not only just caused by energy prices, but you see it in rising food costs as well. We've touched on this on previous episodes, but you're getting this squeezed middle now. So the people at the bottom of the rung have always been squeezed, I would say, or have certainly been squeezed quite a bit under the Conservative government, but it's now affecting those in the middle more, and those who would have traditionally voted Conservative in the past. They're having to tighten their belts as well, which means that at least for Rishi Sunak, and hoping to get voters on his side, that's going to be another detriment to him. And he doesn't seem to have much of an answer for that at the moment, at least not in the short term. And then finally, you have the strikes that are going on, particularly through December. It seems to be a popular month for strikes, as you can have your biggest impact in a month where Christmas is on the horizon. So we've seen rail strikes. Rail strikes are going to happen over Christmas. That's one that has been rumbling on for a long time. We were talking to Mick Lynch in the summer about, with the RMT and how they were hoping to raise wages. They clearly haven't been able to come to a solution, so you've got more strikes there. There are strikes in the Royal Mail as well. Great time for them to strike, very inconvenient for the public, but it makes a point. You've always got to strike when you feel that the effect is going to be the worst for the people involved, so you can really make your point that how valuable those workers are. And maybe most significantly of all, the RCN, or the Royal College of Nursing, they've decided to go on strike for the first time, maybe ever. The nurses and doctors do hardly ever go on strike because that job is seen as more of like a vocation. They wouldn't want to abandon patients if they can help it, but that they've decided to take industrial action and that is happening in December as well, on the 15th and 20th. It's essentially, things are not going well when the BBC have to run a news article with a calendar, so you can sort of pick out when all the strikes are happening and what day is going to be the most disruptive. Like, strikes have certainly not been a part of my life up to I heard about Thatcher and the coal mines and those sort of big industrial action didn't seem to happen whilst I was growing up. There have been some notes. There's been the junior doctors strike, which is maybe the biggest one I can think in recent memory, where a large group of people took that action, and it had a big impact on sort of the national picture. But to have so many happening at once, I think shows that the Conservatives have a real problem and our economy has a real problem, because it's clear that lots more people are feeling under pressure for a variety of reasons, some of which we've mentioned before, like rising inflation, rising house prices. That's why they want a wage rise, because they feel that they can't survive. But that is exacerbated maybe by the fact that public wages have been behind inflation for years now, right? So it's not just suddenly it's jumped up and they instantly want a pay rise. It's like, no, I've been good and I haven't been asking for a pay rise for the last 7 years when you've given me less than I think I deserve, and now I really need the money and you're really not giving it to me. I've reached breaking point, and I feel that appears to me where the country is going, or at least you've got all of these flashbacks. So and Rishi Sunak doesn't seem to have an answer other than the traditional Conservative answer, which is, we need to make it harder for people to strike, which I guess will stop strikes, but it doesn't solve the core problem of why people are choosing to strike in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean, it is very much everything strike. I like you said, I have no memory of anything like this in my lifetime. As you say, I heard about it happening in the 80s before I was born. And it is exactly the same kind of thing where it's like everyone is striking, but for various reasons. There's a lot of overlapping strikes as well. And I think there's a lot of kind of arguments that get bandied about that are wrong. I mean, firstly, there are some people who are like, I'm fine with strikes until they're minorly inconvenienced. Then they're like, I hate strikes. It's like, well, I mean, that's kind of the point of a strike. That people should be annoyed at it and then moan at the government because the strike has happened, and then the government fixes it. That's the whole point, But like you say, I think I'm trying to remember now with the nursing strike. I think it is the first time it's a full nursing strike. There were strikes of like individual nursing unions previously. I may be wrong on this, but my recollection of a nurse talking on a newscast recently was that they said it was the first time the entirety of nursing has essentially decided to go on strike, which is a big deal. And then the other thing to mention is that you talked about Mick Lynch and other things, and people have had a while to get used to there being strikes going on. They obviously can be irritating. There was a whole bit where they weren't going to strike over the Christmas period for like the RMT unions and stuff, and now they're striking not on. Well, I mean, there's no trains on Christmas Day anyway, I don't think, but they're striking on Christmas Eve and just after. So they're trying to make the point. Like, the government keeps saying, "Oh, come around the table, we'll offer you terms," and then basically lying to them, and so they're like, "Well, we're going to put strikes back on." That's how it works. Like, we don't. But they call off the strikes as a gesture of goodwill when they're offered something, and then the government's kind of said, "Oh no." It's like, well, you're only making this worse, government. And that's the problem. And I think it's probably going to be a long winter as we come through with all these strikes until we come out the other side. But sorry, just to circle back to one other thing you said, was the thing about the inflation. So a thing you'll hear a lot from Conservatives, they're asking for an inflation-busting pay rise. They are not. They've been underpaid, as you pointed out, for many, many years. And if their pay had gone up with inflation over those years, then the 11% they're asking for now, or whatever it is, I think it was the bus drivers got 11% the other day that they accepted. But, if you don't give someone the 2 to 3% increase they're expecting under inflation for 5 years, then asking for an 11% pay rise is still a pay cut in real terms. Because, these things compound. If you get a percentage every year, like 2% every year is more than 11% 5 years later. So, yeah, there's a lot of weasel words and kind of things coming from the government and from Conservatives in general, where they're trying to kind of be like, oh, well, this isn't fair, etc., or this will ruin inflation. It's like, well, these people have been underpaid for a long time, and they've accepted all this austerity stuff. They've accepted, especially like the nurses and doctors, working hard through COVID. And we actually have a nursing shortage at the moment. And if you don't make the pay good for, it's a stressful job, it's a hard job, and then you're asking people to do that on less pay than they deserve, pay that a lot of people can't. I mean, in London, a lot of people can't choose, live in London and work in a London hospital at the same time. It is very difficult for people doing this job, which should be an important one for society. And yeah, just because I'm getting here into kind of more my opinion, definitely, but then just because someone has access to private healthcare doesn't mean you can ignore the nurses in the NHS. Like the NHS, that you often hear the NHS is at breaking point, and it's been at breaking point for a long time, and they find ways to make things work most of the time. But there's only so much you can rely on people's nature to, like, people who work in healthcare want to help people, so you will. They generally don't strike. You get them in on silly hours for less pay than equivalent jobs, which would be less stressful because they're there to help people. There is a point at which that breaks. And, with the pile-on of COVID, low wages, all of this, that's why it's at breaking point. It's like they don't want people to die. They're doctors and nurses. They want people to live. But, you get to that point where it is very hard. Like, I know people in the NHS, you see people dealing with this. The hours they're working are insane. They don't get enough sleep. They can barely, sometimes people are going with shift work and stuff. It messes up your sleep patterns. There's so much going on there. And it's not just, they're greedy and they want a bit more money. And there's a lot of misinformation going around, especially on things like Twitter. I know you said you left Twitter, but you see people going on, and luckily a lot of people are good at shutting them down, but there's a lot of bots at the moment as well. You can see where they're like posting the same stuff against the unions, and don't know if they're, no one knows if they're Russian bots or if they're being paid for by our government. It's kind of like all of that, obviously, who's making it. There definitely are bots because it's copy pasted, but who's running them, no one's actually really sure. And it's just awful. I don't really have much else to add. I've just kind of gone on a bit of a ramble there, but yeah, I mean, support people who are striking, and we should pay people a fair wage. It's that simple.
Yeah, it's easy. I think you've mentioned doctors and nurses, and we've mentioned the railways. I don't think this thing is going to stop by December. I think people in education might strike soon. I know that the head teachers union are looking to vote on a strike, which is like head teachers. They don't head teachers are usually never the ones to strike. You've had teacher strikes before, and it's showing that it's not just sort of, these problems are not isolated to one industry where you might go, the railways have always been a bit of a trouble for us ever since we privatized them. Okay, yeah, that I understand that, or I understand that the government has taken its eye off the ball of this area, but it's like, oh no, it's doctors, it's the railways, it's Royal Mail, it's border staff, it might be teachers, core things that keep a country running. All of them are going on strike at the same time, or all of them are feeling the same pressures, which for me at least indicates that there is a deeper problem there. If everything is starting to go that way, then that needs a seismic change, and maybe a change in direction from the government at least, or something. But at the moment, Rishi Sunak doesn't seem to have the answers to those problems.
Yeah, I know we'll get to the polling in a bit, but I think it's one of the reasons the polls have not really changed since Sunak came back since Sunak took over from Liz Truss. So then I guess the last thing to touch on before we move into those polls to discuss them is some government U-turns. We love a U-turn. Boris did a load. How many have we had since Sunak took over?
So there have been some noticeable ones recently, and you're right. You said, Boris used to do them loads, because the one thing Boris was bad at was party discipline, even though he'll keep reminding you that he got a record-breaking, or whatever it was, he got a historic 70-seat majority. The Conservative leaders, the prime ministers, are now really struggling to have a semblance of party loyalty to get the policies they want to get through. So the big ones that we've had recently are they had a manifesto pledge to build 300,000 homes a year. That has been abandoned by Rishi Sunak. He didn't want to abandon it, but backbenchers put pressures on him. NIMBY groups essentially saying, people in my constituency don't want the houses built here. And that built up into such a, sort of a cacophony of support that Rishi Sunak was forced to listen to his backbenchers rather than follow through on a manifesto commitment. Similarly, the Conservatives said that they wouldn't build any onshore wind farms in the UK. They've done a U-turn on that. So it's been the case since 2015 that they've said they'll build no onshore wind farms. They've done a U-turn on that because of backbench pressure. And the funny thing here is that Rishi Sunak, as we sort of mentioned in the first part, we're talking about the leadership contest, he was the leader who seemed to have the greatest support amongst his own MPs. He was meant to sort of be the unity candidate. That was one of the why did he get through? Why did MPs like him so much? He was meant to be the sensible one. He was meant to be stable, and he was meant to bring the party together. However, it doesn't seem to be quite the case, that that's happened now, and he's still seeing those same sort of mumblings and murmurings going on his backbenches. So I guess the big question about that is, why is that happening now? And we'll go on to look at the polls in a little bit, but they're not looking great for the Conservatives. And the consensus seems to be that this is very much the end of this party's life cycle in charge, right? They've been in charge for 12 years, and it is very difficult for parties to keep in power longer than that, because you have the churn of MPs who get through, who want to go. We were talking about Liz Truss when she had to put her cabinet together, how limited she was from choices within the party, because the talent was starting to move to the back benches because they'd all been in government before. Liz Truss's cabinet, she was the only survivor from the Cameron cabinet who took over in 2010. That was it. That's how much sort of talent churn you've had through the Conservative Party, and they haven't had many new people in. Now they're kind of having to play the greatest hits in Rishi Sunak's cabinet by, bringing Jeremy Hunt back, and here's still Michael Gove. But those ones that fall to the backbenches, their voices are made louder. They have their own little group of supporters behind them, those big wigs, those figures back there. They make more noise, harder for Rishi Sunak to keep the party discipline in that way. Also, you keep party discipline, I've mentioned this tons of times before. MPs are loyal because they think they might get a job out of it. They might get a cabinet position, some promise of power in the future. The reality of the thing is that they look at the party now and they say, even if I'm the most loyal person in the world, I don't think that this government or this party is going to last another 2 or 3 election cycles where I might get a cabinet job, so I might as well vote with my heart rather than with my head. And similarly, and finally, you have a lot of MPs. I think we've got 15 Conservative MPs who have already said they're going to stand down by the next election, and some high-profile ones at that. So Sajid Javid has said he'll stand down, and although Matt Hancock is now an independent after his jaunt to the jungle, he's also said that he will step down as an MP, which means that those fairly influential figures, again, won't care as much about the way they'll vote. If there's something that is closer to their heart than government policy, they will probably vote with their heart. And that's why you get this drift. That's why Rishi Sunak will slowly find it more and more difficult to get things through and follow through with those manifesto pledges. Compare that to sort of a party that is fresh, that hasn't been in power for a while, have been out of power for so long, they're just so happy to be in power that, yes, of course, they'll vote for the manifesto. That's the kind of way that Labour's feeling. So that's why you look at the opposite benches and they have entirely the opposite feeling to the Conservative Party. They're the ones with energy, they're the ones with drive, and they're the ones saying, yes, Keir, we believe in you. They don't want that infighting, because that's kind of Conservative. So, yeah, that's where we're at.
I think one question I want to ask at this point, before we go into the polls and kind of touch more a bit on what you just said, this, as someone who's trying to look at history repeating itself, we talked about how we have strikes now, it's a bit like the 80s again. How does this compare, would you feel, to the end of the last Conservative government? So under John Major, that kind of period where things dwindled out post-Thatcher. Is this comparable? I think some people have drawn some comparisons, but I didn't know. You're the one who has studied politics here, so I'll leave the floor to you.
So in some ways, yes, some ways no. So like with strike action, for example, defeating the strikers was one of the things that made Margaret Thatcher and sort of made her popular within the country, because strikes had been very disruptive to the country before then under Heath, who was the Conservative Prime Minister before Thatcher. He essentially ran election on who runs the country, me or the strikers, and the country decided it wasn't Edward Heath. So Thatcher made her name in that way of getting rid of the strikers, and was prepared for it. She'd done the groundwork to make sure that they couldn't come back for a while, essentially, or that they could definitely outlast the strikers. So, very different in that sense. Where it is very similar is towards the end of the Major government, you had 2 big things happen. One was that people felt the Conservatives had lost the economy. There was an event called Black Wednesday where they tried to enter the European Monetary Union or an exchange. The markets rejected it. They were forced to pull out, and it lost the economy quite a bit of money. The Conservatives actually recovered that loss in economic terms pretty much by the time 1997 was there, but it didn't matter. The public perception of them had changed. and they were seen as bad with the economy. So I think we can see very clear parallels there with that and the Conservative Party in 1997. The other thing that was going on was sleaze back in 94. So you had a series of scandals. You had Cash for Questions, where it was said that Conservative MPs were taking money from lobbyists to ask very targeted questions within the House of Commons. You had a variety of sort of sex scandals going on at the time as well. People generally felt that the Conservative Party were giving MPs a bad name, and that's quite the achievement, quite frankly. And you saw that under Boris Johnson in lots of guises, particularly the Christopher Pincher affair, which was ultimately the sleaze scandal that brought Johnson down. But you also saw it, you're seeing it with other ministers now. You're seeing it with Braverman. You saw it with Williamson. You had, I can't remember his name. I believe he's been cleared now. But there were other Conservative ministers who had to resign for a variety of scandals. And that mires your party in controversy as well. So I think on those two fronts, the economy and sleaze, that's where we're seeing real parallels. And yeah, that's where you also go, oh my goodness, it might take the Conservatives a generation or a decade to recover from this, because it is very hard when you've had that much time in power, but at the end of it, things appear to have dwindled out and gone so wrong. I think the Conservatives are doing a lot of navel gazing at the moment about what they've achieved in the past 12 years. And I don't think it is too harsh to say that the Conservatives themselves would say they haven't really achieved what they were going for in those 12 years. Not since New Labour, not since Tony Blair, have we had a prime minister that's had full control over the country see out their term in office, right? Because they've all had to resign, because they've all had something going on like COVID or Brexit disrupting their plans, and now it's come to this point, and they're left with nothing. It seems really unlikely they're going to win the next election. So a lot of problems for the Conservative Party at the moment, which I think is reflected in the poll.
What a lovely segue that is. So to take you to our usual, we have our two polls. So we've got, I need to click on the link. We've got our two polls. We have electoral calculus. That actually was updated about 12 days ago. But I mean, wow, look at those probabilities. So I can't remember the last time we dipped into electoral calculus. It was it might even have been last season, actually.
Yeah.
We dropped in and we're like, the chance of Labour having a majority was definitely over 50%. But, there's still some question there because things were close in the polls. The current prediction is a Labour majority of 200. That is big. Predicting Labour 425 seats, which is 60 more than the Conservatives have at the moment. And then 134 seats for the Conservatives. That's very small. It's not quite as bad as if you look at some of the outlier polls we saw, where if you looked at the outlier polls, the SNP could become the second biggest party, which I think we touched on previously. But still, that is shocking. I mean, I'm trying to think back to the Blair landslide. I'm just going to search it actually so I can compare. But yeah, I don't know if we think back to the Blair landslide, was it even that good?
No, it wasn't that good. Yeah.
Yeah. So Blair had 418 to 165 for the Conservatives, and then Lib Dems actually did quite well in that one. They had 46, that's kind of almost other than the coalition, one of the heights of the Lib Dems, I think. So yeah, I mean that would be a significant shift. It would be like that time when everyone was singing things can only get better on the streets and stuff, because it was such a landslide victory. That's quite impressive. And then if you look down at the probability of possible outcomes, there's a 94% chance of a Labour majority and a 6% chance of a Labour minority, which I think anyone with maths skills can tell me is 100%. And the probability of being the largest party, which I guess is probably calculated a slightly different way, which is why this isn't 100%, 98%. That's pretty damning for the Conservatives. Obviously, there has been some change since the end of November, but I don't think it's generally been in the favour of the Conservatives that much. There's a bit tightening of the polls. But when I say tightening, the gap is wide. So if we go back over to Politico poll of polls, let me remind you, just before 2020 started, at the end of 2021, the parties were kind of neck and neck, which isn't a terrible position to be in this long into a government where you're like, oh, well, the opposition were kind of equal. And then, as we've said throughout the year, the Labour has kind of slowly taken this lead. And they've stayed like 5% on average ahead until just before Truss. We had a few dips here and there, but if you look at the overall thing, almost like Boris leaving almost doesn't register. When Liz Truss comes in, there's an 11% lead for Labour, so 42% to 31%. During Liz Truss's tenure, this peaks at 52% for Labour to 22% Conservative, which is such a massive margin. It's kind of hilarious. And then when Sunak came back in at 51% to 24%, and it's kind of leveled out now, it's still a 21% lead on average for Labour, which is, that's a big lead.
Yeah. And it shows that, first of all, it shows the damage that Liz Truss was able to do to the brand of the Conservative Party. As we've mentioned, losing that economic credibility is something that's hard to regain, even when I think the public is questioned on what they think of Rishi Sunak. They think that he is far more economically competent than Liz Truss. He was a popular Chancellor of the Exchequer during COVID and is seen as somebody who generally knows his sums. She's done the damage there, but he hasn't been able to recover he could recover a little bit because Liz Truss was the worst candidate designed in a lab somewhere to destroy the Conservative Party. He can recover it slightly, but it seems at the moment that the problems now are so insurmountable that there doesn't seem to be a chance that they can go up above the Labour Party. So unless a lot of stuff can happen in politics, there could be a huge scandal. So nothing is ever 100% nailed on. But that polling gap is quite steady now, and it's just a question of, do the Conservatives see sort of like going on in the doldrums? Will they have a little raise, or is there anything worse that's going to happen that could bring them back down to Truss levels of support? Because when we say when you say like he steadied the ship or whatever, there's lots of analogies I could use here. When Liz Truss was leader, the Conservative Party was bleeding out, right? And it was the doctors were saying they have days to live. Now, with Sunak in charge, they've stemmed the bleeding, but the wound is still very much fatal, it appears. But it's going to be just sort of like a slow a very slow death for them, rather than the quick one happened to us.
Yeah, no, I mean, as a colourful metaphor, but yes, sounds about right, I guess. And I think one thing I haven't left Twitter fully. I am on Mastodon, though I haven't moved the podcast there yet. I should probably get round to making another 5 accounts as I'm wont to do. But I get a notification on one of my Twitter accounts every day, which is like, oh, these are the latest polls, and it's like literally every single poll, because at some point I like to poll, and so now I get to see every single one, and it is quite impressive just to see every single poll come through with like a 20 to 30% lead for Labour consistently. In fact, the one the other day that I saw was Reform have gone up. So, you can see where kind of some Conservative voters are going, and they're like Reform being the previously the Brexit Party and all of that. So yeah, I mean, it's not surprising they're kind of the right splitting again in that way. Although I would imagine at an actual general election, a lot of those people probably won't vote Reform. They'll probably vote Conservative. But yeah, it is interesting to see. I guess if this is where they are, is there any way? Like you kind of touched on this a bit, saying you don't think there's anywhere for them to go. But how could they recover if, hypothetically?
They need everything to go right for them. The economy needs to recover slightly, to a great extent. If they can come out the other side of this and somehow say that, we've recovered, but the rest of Europe hasn't recovered. Wasn't Brexit such a great idea? We're the party that brought you Brexit. That might be a way back out of this. They, at the moment, the message they're trying to sell is, I know that we're in economic problems, but the whole of the rest of the world is, so don't complain, maybe it'll get better, which isn't a very good argument to try and sell to the general public. So yeah, I think definitely the economy needs to recover. There might have to be another big event, like nobody saw COVID on the horizon. If something else happens and the country is forced to come together and you're forced to rally behind a figure of unity, that usually falls to the people who were in power at the time. That might happen, although I don't know if, again, I'm sort of the opinion now that if COVID happened again or something to that extent, would the country be in a place where it wants to rally around the Conservatives, or would they just immediately demand a change in government, a change in party in charge, because they say, no, you messed up the last time, we've got to have somebody new in charge. So yeah, that's all I've got. I'm afraid, for the Conservatives. It is pretty scant, and I think even amongst their MPs and supporters, and I've talked to some who've just said, yeah, like maybe it's time that we weren't in power anymore and we gave the other people a chance. The Conservatives would say, hey, give Labour a chance, and then the country can remember how bad they are, and then we'll sweep in and save everybody. But that's the best. If that's your best play, if that's how you want to restore confidence by leaving power, then yeah, you've definitely already lost power, haven't you? So yeah, it seems to be going one way at the moment, but of course it requires the Labour Party to do
Step
something
up
now
and
yes.
Be your opposition. I guess they have to. You need a credible opposition to oust the current government, even if the current government's doing badly. So I guess, yeah, I mean, what policies and stuff. We had a Labour Party conference that I think we kind of glossed over at the time because everything was a bit manic. So I guess there may have been some things announced there that would be relevant now, or some stuff they've said since.
Yeah, so the thing for Labour now is your opposition always wants to appear like you're a government in waiting. And we've mentioned, particularly under Keir Starmer at the start of his premiership, that Labour seemed to be the I'm not Boris Johnson party rather than a party that had any policies of themselves. They were an opposition, but were they effective? There was a big question mark over that. Now they are seen pretty much as a government in waiting by themselves and by a lot in the country. They have to come forward with their own policy regime. At the Labour Party conference, they came up with a big one, which was Great British Energy, which was the idea that there would be a publicly owned energy company, a lot like EDF, which is the French one. And then if you have your own publicly owned energy, you can use the profits of that to put back into your own economy. EDF is quite successful, I believe. Like their nuclear power, they sell some of that power to us over in the UK.
You can have EDF Energy be your supplier in the UK, and there was definitely a period of time where they were quite popular because they had an advert featuring an anthropomorphic gas flame that everyone thought was really cute in like 2012.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a policy, and also like to say that we're going to make sure that something like this crisis over gas can't happen again, because there will be a government-owned company, and it would be far easier for them to put a windfall tax or to control the gas prices if they owned the company in the first place. They wouldn't have to do these deals with the private companies that the Conservatives had to for their energy policy. So yeah, I think that's sort of a winner, or something that they're onto there. Very recently, in partnership with Gordon Brown, they've released a big report on some of the reforms they would do if they came in charge, particularly when it comes to devolution and how you sort power and sort of constitutional issues within the country. Two big things to come out of that is they want increased devolution, so that's within England and Wales. We've already got things like metro mayors, but they want to give them far more power. Follow kind of what we've got, more of a European model, where those local regions have a lot of power, can be quite flexible, and make sure that the best policy for that area is introduced. One of the big criticisms of Boris Johnson and his levelling up policy was that it's really just sort of levelling up for the northeast, and that there are vast swathes of the country that were sort of left out of there because they're not the ones that voted Conservative in the 2019 election, so we don't have to reward them. Labour don't want it to be they don't want places to sort of have to rely on their money if you voted for the leading party in the latest election. They want it to be far fairer, so you can have the choices made by your own local governments, which sounds like a good idea. If people will engage with it is a big question mark, but that's a little bit further down the line. The second big thing that kind of made headlines as well was they want to get rid of the House of Lords, which is an idea that's always been sort of thrown around a little bit. Me personally, I think the idea of getting rid of the House of Lords is good, but you do need a second chamber that needs to be responsible in some way. How would you vote for that second chamber? For me, I would say that you would have like a PR-based system for that House of Lords. So you would have your MPs that still were voted on first past the post, and they would represent your local area, where an upper chamber would be decided by proportional representation and would have like more of a national guise about it, mirroring sort of what they do in the German system, which is one I quite like. But that, of course, is going to be controversial, and issues of constitution and getting those changes are usually very difficult to do so unless you have a massive majority in Parliament, which, as you say, if those polls are to be believed, if those electoral calculus is to believe, Labour might have. But yeah, it's quite a bold policy. But I do think the fact that they are putting out these sort of documents scuppers one of those common attack lines the Conservatives have within Prime Minister's questions, which is, Labour, you're always criticising, but you haven't got any ideas of your own. When are you going to come up with some policies? Now they're formulating policies. I think now is the best time for them to do that, and it's not just a pipe dream or something that all might happen on a, 2 rolls of the dice. Maybe it's that sort of probability. Like, no, it seems like a sure thing. So that's why the electorate and the media and a lot of people within politics have now got to look towards them and say, these are policies. This is what our government is going to look like. And that's a way that they can help increase their support going into the next general election.
Yeah, I think, but they have to differentiate themselves in some way, and you'd like to hope if the country is ready for change in general, that maybe you can get through some kind of more progressive changes, like you said, the House of Lords. The idea of PR, I don't know if that's the way we slowly sneak in PR by the back door. We bring in the House of Lords via PR, and everyone goes, oh, actually, that's quite good, isn't it? And then you roll that out to the House of Commons in time. That would be quite cool if that's the way it happens. I have a feeling it probably won't be. It'll be some kind of halfway house, unfortunately, would be my expectation. But, I've been burned before, I guess. So, yeah, would be lovely to have a PR version of the House of Lords. Or I think there are other ideas people have floated as well, like the idea where there's like the terms in the House of Lords are different or something, so that because one of the benefits the House of Lords has is that long staying power. That means people, you're not tied to the current government's whims, and you don't want to end up with the kind of US style Senate where like everything is as bad as in the House in the US, essentially. There is something about that upper chamber having, some requirement, whatever that would be, to change it. But then obviously it gets tricky because someone has to decide where that line is, what that requirement is. And it is kind of, what is the differentiation between them and why? And how do you back that up and how do you maintain it? It's that is a whole episode, I'm sure, in and of itself, where we talk about potential ways of doing it, and maybe that's a thing, since it's not going to happen anytime soon, maybe that's a one to put away as a summer special for when you want to tell me about all the different ways we could implement a House of Lords that was better without landed gentry in it and bishops. Fingers crossed, Labour. I think that's the general view of a lot of people at the moment. They're like, come on, Labour, please don't stuff it up. You've got 2 years to not stuff it up. So yeah, we'll see what happens. And yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. You've been very in-depth as always, Rob. So I don't think there's much left for me to do other than the usual plugging of our various places out there. So you can still find us on Twitter amongst that Dumpsters Fire at Unparl Podcast, as well as on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us at our website, parliamentary.observer, where you can comment on the show and find all the podcast episodes in their kind of original form. That's where they are. Obviously, you can follow us on any podcatcher you enjoy. Just search for Unparliamentary Language. Presumably, that's how you're listening to us now. But if you're listening to us on the website and you want to subscribe and always get the episodes in your feed, that's the best way to do it. And then, of course, finally, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS, where for a mere $1 a month, you can get access to a whole host of bonus episodes that we've done over the years. Mostly it's Rob and I chatting about stuff we like or video games or whatever. But there's also been some crossover episodes with other podcasts on the network, which are interesting. Particularly, would like to point out the Politics of Mulan episode we did, which was kind of, I guess that wasn't literally what it was, but it was we had a kind of a fight between political figures using Mulan as the reason. It was a bit weird. A crossover there with the podcast Mish Mash Mayhem, which is currently on a kind of extended hiatus, but hopefully comes back when the hosts have a bit more time and are in the same country for more than a few days. But yes, I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Hi. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took the schoolyard conversation of which one of my favourite fictional characters would win in a fight? Well, wonder no more. Join me, Chris, and my co-host Matt every other Sunday for Mish Mash Mayhem, and you can find out.